While she was in high school in Dayton, Ohio, Raquel Bain became known as a bit of a thrill seeker, primarily because she would do something called car surfing, which is exactly what it sounds like. She would climb onto the exterior of cars and hold on to the roof while somebody else drove it around. In addition to seeking out these physical thrills, Raquel was also drawn to psychological ones, like going to places that were supposedly haunted and seeing if she could spook herself. Following high school, Raquel kind of calmed down and became less of the wild teenager she was known for being, and instead she really focused on building a life and a career for herself. And so she would go to college and she would earn her degree in surgical technologies, and then by 2009 she was employed full-time as a surgical assistant in Dayton. Also around that time, she had her first child, a son, who she adored. But despite creating this life full of stereotypically adult, mature things like having a career and starting a family, deep down, Raquel was still very much the thrill-seeking wild teenager she was back in high school. But as an adult, she just never had time to go seek out those thrills. So with that in mind, fast forward to April of 2016. By this point, Raquel is 26 years old, and that month, a very rare weekend popped up where Raquel did not have to work and she didn't have any childcare responsibilities. And so, wanting to take advantage of this free time, Raquel asked her boyfriend, 41-year-old David Nee, if he would join her on a road trip that weekend to Louisville, Kentucky, where Raquel wanted to check out the infamously scary Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Back in the 1900s, Waverly Hills was a place where tuberculosis patients were sent. Tuberculosis, or TB for short, is an infection of the lungs and it can be deadly. Today, there's a cure for it, but back in the early 1900s, there wasn't. And so most of the people who went to Waverly Hills died there, and usually very slowly and painfully and in total isolation from their families, because in virtue of being sent to Waverly Hills, they were effectively being quarantined to stop the spread of the disease. Waverly Hills would eventually shut down permanently in 1961 because by that point the cure had been found, and after it shut down, the building basically just sat there. Nobody else came in and turned it into anything else. And so this building is basically abandoned, and lots of people began sneaking in to see what it was like in there, and a shocking number of these trespassers reported seeing ghosts inside. Today, the sanatorium is still very much in the same condition it was left in, but the Waverly Hills Historical Society has stepped in and made it very hard for people to sneak into the building. However, knowing people do want to go in and look around, the Historical Society has begun offering guided tours of the sanatorium, and these tours are given exclusively at night to increase the spooky effect. And so David, who had only been dating Raquel for a month when she asked him to come with her to the sanatorium, he was not really that keen on doing this. It did not really appeal to him to go walking around this totally terrifying place, but he could tell it was important to Raquel. She was really excited about it, and so he agreed to go. A few days later, on the late afternoon of April 23rd, the new couple left Raquel's place, they climbed into the car, and they began driving south. 3 hours later, they arrived in Louisville and they stopped to get dinner. And then after they were done eating, they looked at the time and realized it was only about 6:45 p.m. and the tour they had scheduled at the sanatorium was not until 10 p.m. So they had a few hours to kill. And before David could suggest anything, Raquel already had the perfect idea of how they should kill this time. She told David that earlier that day, she had learned about a spot just outside of Louisville that might actually be more terrifying than the sanatorium they had come all this way to see. And so Raquel wanted to spend these few hours checking out this new spooky spot. This spooky spot was a rickety old, narrow, abandoned-looking bridge called the Pope Lick Trestle. It's located just east of downtown Louisville in this heavily wooded area. The bridge is about 800 feet long, and at its highest point, right in the middle of the bridge, it's about 90 to 100 feet off the ground. And this bridge connects the tops of two of the bigger rolling hills in the area. But the bridge's physical appearance has nothing to do with why it's considered so spooky. The reason the Poplik trestle has become a central part of Kentucky folklore is because locals say there is a monster called the Poplik monster that lives underneath the bridge. It's half goat, half man, and when anyone is near this bridge at night, this monster is supposed to come out from underneath this bridge, and then what happens next is very ambiguous. It kind of depends on who you're talking to, but generally speaking, once the Poplik monster has emerged and it sees you, you're dead. Now, how you die ranges from the monster leaping out and attacking you with an axe to the monster using some sort of mind control to lure you up onto the bridge where you leap off. David, after hearing this suggestion, was again not really that keen to go do this really terrifying sounding thing, but seeing the excitement in his girlfriend's face, he agreed to go. And so the two left the restaurant, they climbed back in the car, and they drove for about 15 or 20 minutes to the Poplik Trestle Bridge. The bridge actually passed over a relatively main road, and so the couple parked just off the side of this main road, and then once they were outside, they began looking for a pathway up this hillside to get up to the bridge. And very quickly, they found a well-worn dirt path that snaked up the side of this wooded hillside that looked very much like it would bring them up to the bridge. So with Raquel in front and David behind her, they began walking up this dirt path. And as they're walking, they start to see signs that clearly say, "No trespassing." But they ignore them because they're looking at this path thinking, okay, lots of people clearly come up here, so we've got to be okay. And so they keep on walking up this path, and they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill where they think it's going to connect with this bridge. And right as they're getting close, they see there's this huge chain link fence, this 8-foot tall chain link fence with barbed wire across the top that extends in either direction out of view. And so the couple walks up to this fence, and there are more signs that say no trespassing, private property, and there are additional warning signs saying that what is on the other side of this fence is also just plain dangerous, so turn around and leave. As Raquel and David are staring at all these signs and this fence, they see, not far from the path, somebody had clearly bent two of the fence posts and created a narrow gap in the fence that you could slip through. And so from David and Raquel's perspective, that looked like the way other trespassers must have found their way up to the bridge, and so it must be safe. And so once again, the couple disregarded all the warnings. They made their way over to this gap in the fence, they both slipped through, and they kept on walking up the hill. Just a couple of minutes later, they reached this clearing, which was at the top of this hill, and once they were in this clearing, they were able to turn, and they could actually see the bridge. It was only a couple hundred feet away from them, and it was totally intimidating. By this point, it's totally dark out, and from their perspective, all they see is this very narrow bridge that they know is 100 feet off the ground at certain points, and they can see there's no guardrails on either side of this bridge. It would have almost looked like a tightrope kind of extending off into the darkness. But even if the couple was really intimidated by the sight of this bridge and with all these warning signs before it, they were able to put their fear aside and just keep on going. And so with David now in the lead and Raquel behind him, they walked the couple of hundred feet over to the start of this narrow bridge. And when they got there, without actually stepping onto the bridge, David came to a stop. He turned around to face Raquel and he gestured for her to come stand next to him so they could take a selfie with the bridge in the background. Because David at this point is thinking, we're not going to go on this bridge. We're just going to look at this bridge, take some pictures, and then we'll go. But Raquel, who he's looking at, gesturing to come stand with him, just walks right past him onto the bridge and takes several steps out onto this narrow, rickety old thing, and then she stops, turns around, and gestures for David to come with her and walk across the entire bridge. And David, again, is having his second thoughts, but he sees Raquel wants to do this, and so he agrees to go. After they had walked about 100, maybe 200 feet across this bridge, the two of them just started laughing because it was totally exhilarating what they were doing. Not so much the quest for the Poplik monster, but rather the very real risk they were taking walking this tightrope bridge in the middle of the night. The couple would continue to very cautiously but quickly make their way across this bridge, and when they reached about the halfway point, when they were at the highest point from the ground, the bridge itself begins to shake. and then from behind them, they hear this loud grinding sound. And so the couple, they whip their heads around and they see there are these two bright glowing lights that are looking right at them all the way on the start of the bridge. And they realize it's a train. When Raquel and David walked up that dirt path and snuck through the fence and reached the top of the hill and could actually see the Pope Lick Trestle Bridge, they would have also seen the train tracks in the hillside that clearly extended onto the Pope Lick Trestle and went across the bridge. This was a train bridge. They would have seen that. But it's assumed that the couple, who didn't live in the area and so didn't know much about the Pope Lick Trestle, it's assumed they thought, well, this is a train bridge, but it's got to be abandoned. It certainly looks abandoned, and it does. It looks totally old. It does not look active, even though it is. Or the couple thought, well, this is just an old train bridge. It might be active, but surely no train is going to come through anytime soon. We can get across the bridge before a train arrives. But, of course, they were wrong. When the couple turned around and saw these two headlights bearing down on them, they quickly realized they would not be able to outrun this train. The train's clearly trying to stop. It has seen them. It's hitting its brakes. It's sounding its horn, but it's just clearly moving too quickly. So they cannot run to the other side to safety. And because this bridge was meant for a single train to pass through, there was no other track they could just jump onto to avoid being hit. And there were no walkways on either side of this railway. And so literally all they had was the track that this train was going to cross over, and they were on it. And so with no other choices, David yells to Raquel that they have to climb down and hang off the side of this bridge. Now, there were these wooden slats that ran underneath the rails. They ran perpendicular to the rails, and these wooden slats kind of extended off the edge of the bridge on either side just a couple of inches. And so in theory, if you were holding onto the outside of one of these wooden slats and kind of dangling off the edge of the bridge, a train could cross those tracks and not run over your hands or fingers. You would just have to hold on that whole time as the train is rumbling through. And so David, he flops down onto his stomach and he's trying to lower himself as fast as he can as this train is getting closer and closer, and he's yelling for Raquel to do the same thing, but she's not really moving very quickly. And finally, David, he gets in position. He's hanging off the edge of this bridge on these wooden slats, and he sees Raquel. She's not quite there, and then the train comes flying through. It strikes Raquel and sends her flying off the bridge to the ground below. David would somehow manage to hold on the whole time as this train went past him. And then once the train had passed him, he pulled himself back up onto the tracks. He ran the rest of the way across the bridge. He went down that hillside. And when he found Raquel, it was immediately apparent that she was deceased. In the end, the railroad was not issued any citations or sued for negligence. It was determined they did their due diligence by setting up that 8-foot-tall barbed wire fence with all those signs telling people to stay back and warning people about the hazards of going past this fence. And so it was actually David who got in trouble for this tragedy. He was cited and charged with a felony of unlawfully disrupting and or delaying a train, causing financial damages. He would plead to a lesser charge of trespassing and would be fined $2,300. Shockingly, this tragedy is just one of many that have occurred on the Pope Lick Trestle Bridge. Since the bridge's construction in the 1800s, there have been dozens of people who have died on this bridge. And several of these deaths, many of them fairly recent, the last 20 or so years, have occurred under the same conditions as Raquel's. People went looking for the Pope Lick monster and then were struck by a train.
On the evening of January 9th, 2010, 34-year-old Jarmeka Whitehead, whose friends all called her Nikki, spooned coleslaw onto a platter and watched as guests began to filter into her home, which was located just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a gated community. Standing by the front door greeting the guests were Nikki's 16-year-old twin daughters, Jazz and Taz. Nikki had been nervous about hosting this party tonight, but so far, everything was going well. She'd made a fish fry, and her whole family had come and brought even more food. She had worked all day at the hair salon where she was a beautician, but she'd still had some time to decorate and hang up handwritten posters that read, "Taz and Jazz, welcome home, we love you." Now, Taz was here laughing it up with her family, and it made Nikki really happy. But as she looked around, she realized that Jazz was nowhere to be seen. Nikki frowned. This party was really supposed to be a celebration of forgiveness and new beginnings, but there was still a lot of hurt to get over in their little family. Because for the last year and a half, Taz and Jazz had not been living at home with Nikki. Nikki had lost custody of her kids after the three of them got into a huge fight and Nikki called the police. She had thought that calling the police would just scare the girls into behaving better, but that's not what happened. Instead, a judge decided that Nikki was not a fit parent and sent the girls to go live with Nikki's grandmother, Della Frazier. Nikki had been heartbroken. She herself had come from a tough background, and she had tried so hard to break the cycle for her kids. She had actually been raised by Della, who was her grandmother and so her daughter's great-grandmother, because when she was born, her own mom was in jail. And also, Nikki had gotten pregnant with the twin girls when she was just 18 years old. But when the girls were born, Nikki had decided that she would not let them make the same mistakes that she had. Instead, Nikki had tried to raise them with strict rules and to focus on academics. And so, Taz and Jazz became Girl Scouts, they did dance and music classes, and they made the honor roll at school. Until they became teenagers, everyone always said how sweet and well-behaved they were. But when they hit 13 years old, they began sneaking out and getting into fights, and nothing Nikki did seemed to rein them in. When Nikki finally lost custody of her kids to her grandmother Della, she had worried she might never get her girls back. But she had done a lot of hard work, including enrolling in college classes, and finally, she had regained custody and her girls were home, living with her and her boyfriend, Robert Head. Now, everything was not perfect at this point. The girls were very clingy to each other, and they openly said they missed Della, their great-grandmother. But for tonight, Nikki felt like, on the whole, things were pretty good. Except that one of the girls, Jazz, seemed to have disappeared from the party already. Nikki went and found her best friend and asked her to go look for Jazz. Her friend nodded and then slipped away, and Nikki waited nervously by the food for her friend to come back. And only a few minutes later, the friend returned with some good news. She said that Jazz was in her bedroom and was a bit overwhelmed by everything, but they had had a nice conversation about how excited everybody was to have them home. Nikki's friend said that both the girls seemed to be in good spirits, so Nikki should just relax and eat and enjoy the party. At this, Nikki felt a wave of relief wash over her. Then she went back to setting up the fish fry. 3 nights later, on January 12th at about 10:30 p.m., Nikki walked out of her evening class at the local college where she was studying to be a fashion designer and got into her car. It had been a bad day. All the happiness she had felt at the girls' welcome home party was now gone. But this time, it was not because of a fight she had had with the girls. Instead, it was because she and her boyfriend, Robert, had had a nasty argument that afternoon. Nikki and Robert had been together for a decade, and they really loved each other. But their relationship was a little unconventional. Part of it was that Robert was 30 years older than Nikki, and he worked as a long-haul trucker, so he was away from home for days or even weeks at a time. But none of that is what made their relationship truly unusual. What made it really atypical was that their relationship was open, meaning Nikki was allowed to have other boyfriends besides Robert. And this was ultimately what their fight that day had been about. According to the rules they had set up for their relationship, when Robert was home, they were an exclusive couple. But when Robert was away working, Nikki could date anybody she wanted. But Nikki was not supposed to talk to Robert about her other boyfriends. But this morning, she had taken a call from a man named Joe Carter, who she was dating, right in front of Robert. And Robert had been furious and insulted, and Nikki had left to come to class without resolving that fight. Now, all she really wanted to do was go home and relax and just be by herself. And she knew Robert had left on a trucking trip, and the girls were very likely asleep right now. But she couldn't just go home and do that, because the reason her other boyfriend, Joe Carter, had called her that morning was to ask her to come over to his house after her class. So Nikki shook off her exhaustion and drove to Joe's house and rang the bell, hoping that whatever Joe wanted, it would be quick. When Joe answered the door, he looked very serious. He invited Nikki inside, but he seemed incredibly tense and awkward. Nikki had a bad feeling, and she asked Joe what was wrong. But at first, he wouldn't even answer her directly. He just kept talking about old fights they'd had. Nikki had already had a long and emotionally draining day, so she told Joe that whatever was on his mind, he just needed to spit it out. So, Joe told her. He wanted to break up. He was done being part of her open relationship. Nikki was absolutely incredulous. Joe had made her come all the way out here late at night after class after all this just to break up with her? And also, just weeks after her daughters had finally come home, like this is supposed to be a good time in her life, and he's just crushing her? Nikki just stormed out of Joe's apartment and slammed the door behind her. The next day, January 13th, a little before 3:30 p.m., Nikki's twin daughters, Taz and Jazz, got home from school. They walked down Appaloosa Way and turned into the walkway of their home. When they got to the door, Jazz took out her keys and unlocked it. She pushed the door open and stepped in ahead of Taz. And as Jazz did this, she began to scream. Because the entire entryway was covered with blood. There was a trail of it leading into the house. They screamed out for their mother, but they got no answer. And so perhaps against their better judgment, they decided to go in and check on her. And so they followed the trail of blood that brought them all the way to the master bedroom. And when they looked into the master bathroom, they just stood there in silence before turning and bolting out of the house. A Rockdale County Sheriff's deputy was driving his cruiser down Appaloosa Way on his way back to the station after serving a warrant at one of the houses in the neighborhood when he saw two teenage girls sprinting towards his car at full speed. The deputy slammed on his brakes as the girls reached his cruiser and began banging on the windows. They were completely hysterical and screaming incoherently, and when the deputy got out of his cruiser, it took him a second to get them to calm down enough to tell him what was going on. But when they finally did, he radioed back to the station to request backup. About 30 minutes later, around 4 p.m., Detective Ken Swift of the Conyers Police Department stood inside the master bathroom of Nikki Whitehead's home on Appaloosa Way, looking down at Nikki's dead body, partially submerged under the water in the jacuzzi-style tub. This was the bloodiest crime scene that Swift had ever been to. The whole house had a stifling metallic smell from the sheer amount of blood that was soaked into the carpets and smeared all over the walls. Whatever had happened here, Swift could tell it had been long and very violent. The house was trashed. Chairs were tipped over, there were all these jagged pieces of something red and ceramic scattered in the living room, and the floor was littered with magazines that had been knocked off a coffee table. Now, Swift tried to count the number of stab wounds on his victim's body, but it was impossible. This level of brutality suggested pure rage, which meant that Nikki had very likely known her killer. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or anything stolen also supported this theory. Swift put on a pair of gloves and then bent down to gently touch Nikki's head. He could see lots of stab wounds in the back and front of her neck, and there was a strand of hair between her teeth. Swift asked a crime scene tech to take the hair for analysis. Then he stood up and followed the bloody drag marks back out of the bathroom and down the hallway. He found a bloody handprint on a door frame of the master bedroom and also on the doorknob of the front door. There were some bloody footprints of bare feet that officers had discovered outside that suggested that someone, very likely Nikki, had actually run out of the house during the attack, but had either turned around or, if it was Nikki, been dragged back inside. Swift stood at the front doorway looking out at those bloody footprints and also the sea of police vehicles with their flashing blue lights on. He was hopeful that a neighborhood canvass would turn up witnesses. This was, after all, a very safe and very quiet area. Someone running outside covered in blood was sure to attract attention. As he surveyed the scene, his eyes settled on two teenage girls standing on the front lawn with blankets draped over their backs. They were both visibly shaking with sobs and standing close together, and one of them had her arms up over her face. But as Swift watched, he realized that the girl with her arms up wasn't just crying. She was actually also biting her arm, with a look of pure anguish on her face. Now, Swift knew these girls were the victim's daughters, and he also knew they were the ones who found the body. And so, based on what he was seeing, it seemed like they had to be in shock. He was about to walk over to them and offer some words of comfort when a police captain actually intercepted him and just let him know that he had already arranged for the girls to be transported to the station. And so Swift decided he would talk to the girls there. About an hour later, Detective Swift was standing in the police station looking at a TV monitor that showed a live feed of the conference room, where the captain had put Jazz and Taz Whitehead. The girls had calmed down a little bit, but they were still rocking back and forth and obviously crying. By now, the officers had finished canvassing Nikki Whitehead's neighborhood, and shockingly, no one had seen anything. One neighbor reported hearing his doorbell ring in the morning and someone yelling, but he hadn't gotten out of bed to answer it. The only potentially useful information the police had gotten from neighbors was that they had seen a black car they didn't recognize parked on the street near Nikki's house around the time of the murder. But this was not a lot to go on. Until they got forensics back, Swift knew that Taz and Jazz Whitehead were his best hope for any leads. However, they were so distraught he didn't know what he would get out of an interview. But when Swift walked into the conference room, the girls appeared to try to pull themselves together, and Taz told Jazz they had to be strong. Swift put a box of tissues on the table and then gently asked the girls if they could walk him through what had happened. The girls took a minute to compose themselves, and then they began to speak. They told the detective that the day before, their mother had gotten into a bad argument with her boyfriend Robert. But they hadn't really resolved it, and then she had left for class and he had left for work. The girls said that night they stayed up late at their house, but they were in one of their bedrooms talking with each other, so when their mom came home, they didn't hear her. And then that morning, they had overslept and missed the bus. But they ended up walking to school because when they knocked on their mother's door, she didn't answer. The girls said at the time they hadn't thought much of it, and when they left the house, everything looked and seemed normal. They just hadn't seen their mom yet. But when they got home, of course, it had been a different story. The house was ransacked, there was blood everywhere, and when they tried to call out for their mother and she didn't call back, they wound up searching the house, and they would ultimately find her dead inside the tub. At this point, the girls began to break down and start crying again, like they were reliving the moment they found their mother. And to Swift, this made sense. But really what he was thinking about was the part of the story where the girls referenced a fight between Nikki and her boyfriend Robert. The police had been trying to reach Robert ever since they found Nikki's body, but he was on the road in his semi-truck and they hadn't yet been able to track him down. And in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner was always the first suspect, especially when they were not getting along, and according to the girls, that's exactly what was happening right before Nikki had died. However, when Swift asked the girls if Robert and their mom fought often, Taz and Jazz were adamant that they didn't. They said they loved Robert, and so did their mom. Their biological father had not been in their lives, and Robert had really helped to raise them, taking them for rides in his truck and out to eat at McDonald's. He was great. So, Swift asked the twins if there was anybody else they could think of in their mother's life who maybe she wasn't getting along with or who might have wanted to do her harm. And it was at this point that Taz and Jazz brought up Joe Carter. The girls said their mom did really love Robert, but she talked to a lot of other men. And the one name the girls have been hearing a lot recently was Joe Carter, who was their mother's other boyfriend. Now, the way Taz and Jazz brought up this other boyfriend was very casual, like it was totally normal in their lives. But when Swift heard it, he immediately knew he had a compelling motive for Nikki's murder by either Robert or Joe. A love triangle. Detective Swift left the twins in the conference room and walked out of the police station to his cruiser. He couldn't question Nikki's primary boyfriend, Robert, until he could find him. But the twins had told him that Nikki's secondary boyfriend, Joe Carter, worked at a barbershop right next to Nikki's salon, and that was only about a 20-minute drive away from the station. Swift figured that if he hurried, he could catch Joe before his shop closed up for the day. He drove over, and when he stepped into the barbershop, a little bell on the door jingled. Everyone inside the shop reflexively glanced to see who had come in, and Swift cleared his throat and asked if a Joe Carter was around. When one of the barbers gestured that that was him, Swift asked him to step outside. Swift studied Joe's face carefully as he made this request, looking for any sign of nervousness, but Joe just looked confused. He told the customer whose hair he was cutting that he'd be right back, and then followed Swift out onto the sidewalk. Once they were outside, Joe immediately took out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Swift, but Swift shook his head and said no. Joe seemed relaxed and friendly, and like he had genuinely no idea why Swift might be there. So, based on that, Swift decided to just be direct. He told Joe that he had some terrible news. His girlfriend, Nikki Whitehead, had been murdered that morning, and so he needed to know where Joe had been last night. Immediately, Joe began to weep so hard he couldn't even answer the question. And then when he caught his breath, he just tried to light a cigarette, but his hands were shaking too hard to make the lighter even work. And then eventually, he told Swift that he just couldn't believe it. He said he had actually seen Nikki the night before, and she was fine. He admitted they had been having some problems. In fact, he had broken up with her the night before because Nikki had another relationship with another man, Robert. And this caught Swift totally off guard. Joe's reaction definitely seemed sincere, but what he was saying, that he had broken up with the victim less than 12 hours before her murder, essentially because he was jealous of another man, was incredibly incriminating. So Swift told Joe to show him his arms. The detective knew that a knife attack often caused injuries to the attacker as well as the victim, and he wanted to see if Joe had any wounds on his hands or arms. Swift felt a surge of adrenaline as Joe began to roll up his sleeves. But when Joe held out his arms and turned his hands up and then down again to show both sides, his skin was completely uninjured. Now, this was not proof that he was innocent, but it certainly did not make him a stronger suspect either. Joe told Swift he did have an alibi, at least for today. He said he'd been right here at work, which was 15 miles away from Nikki's house. All day long, this is where he was, and his coworkers and clients would all confirm it. With this, Swift was getting a sinking feeling that Joe might not be his guy. But to be thorough, he told him he was going to check on the video and also speak to his coworkers to confirm his alibi, and that Joe would have to come to the station to take a polygraph test. And Joe agreed. Then, right before Swift turned to leave, he remembered a detail from the canvas of Nikki's neighborhood: the unfamiliar black car one neighbor had seen right outside of Nikki's house. And so Swift paused for a second, and then he asked Joe what kind of car he drove. And Joe said he drove a black Toyota. Swift nodded and thanked Joe, and then walked back to his car to drive back to the station. Now, by this point, Joe was not his number one suspect anymore, but Joe had a black car, and also he didn't have an alibi for the night before when he saw Nikki until he showed up at the barbershop the next morning. There was a gap. And so Swift obviously could not rule him out. The following day was Thursday, January 14th, and Swift began the day at his desk, drinking a lukewarm cup of coffee and reading through a stack of papers. So far, he had one good theory about a love triangle that he thought was viable, but he also knew he wanted to keep an open mind about other possible ideas and suspects while he chased down the love triangle angle. The first packet of papers he was looking at were court documents from the ongoing custody case of Taz and Jazz over the last few years. From looking them over, Swift was quite interested to learn that the twins' great-grandmother, Della Fraser, who at one point had looked after the girls, had been very upset when Nikki had regained custody, at least in part because it meant Della would no longer receive money from the state for their care. Custody disputes and money were both reasons people killed each other. Swift knew this. But Della was 75 years old. Nikki's attacker would have had to be very strong with good stamina to stab Nikki that many times. So it didn't feel promising that Della was behind the murder. The second packet of papers that Swift was looking over that morning was the autopsy report. Nikki had been stabbed somewhere between 50 and 80 times, and her spinal cord had been severed. However, while that did give some information, it didn't really give Swift much more than he already knew. I mean, he just looked at the crime scene and knew this was a vicious attack, and the autopsy basically confirmed that. Finally, Swift had a few reports from the uniformed officers who had done the neighborhood canvass. They talked about the mysterious black car that had been spotted, that at this point Swift was thinking might belong to Joe Carter, the second boyfriend, but the uniformed officers also listed information about another mysterious car neighbors had seen. This one was a red sedan, specifically a Dodge Avenger, that had a white hood and missing hubcaps, and apparently it had shown up in the early afternoon outside of Nikki's house. No one saw the driver, and it only stayed for a few minutes. As Swift mulled over all this information he was taking in, the phone on his desk rang. When he answered, he was pleasantly surprised to hear the voice of Nikki's live-in boyfriend, Robert Head, the guy nobody could find. Robert apologized profusely for being so hard to reach and then asked, what's going on? When Swift told him that his girlfriend had been murdered, Robert let out this awful, anguished scream, and then he said he would head home right away. But Swift told him no, just come to the police station. Before Robert hung up, he said he had one more question. How were Taz and Jazz? To Swift, Robert's reaction to the news was fairly genuine, and his immediate concern for the girls did sound fatherly, which was how the girls had described him. But Swift also knew the man could be acting. When Robert arrived at the police station, Swift had him put in an interrogation room. where he watched for a few minutes on the surveillance camera before going inside himself. When Swift looked at Robert up close, he looked like a broken man. He was 64 years old and thin, and he was slumped in his seat looking absolutely miserable. When Swift sat down across from him, he could almost feel Robert's grief from the other side of the table. Robert would turn out to be a very easy interview. He answered all of Swift's questions clearly and fully, and didn't shy away from pretty embarrassing details. He said he knew about Joe Carter, and he didn't mind that Nikki was seeing him. Nikki was young and beautiful and outgoing, and Robert felt lucky that she even wanted to be with him at all. He said he was crazy about Nikki and about her girls, and really he just wanted her to be happy. He admitted to fighting with her the day before she was murdered over her phone call she took from Joe Carter right in front of him, sort of breaking one of their rules, but he said that as soon as he had left and hit the road in his truck, his anger had faded and he had considered their issue closed. And then when Swift told Robert to show him his arms, they were uninjured, just like Joe's. Finally, Robert's truck itself contained proof that he really could not have been the killer, because it had a GPS tracker inside, which put him a full day's drive away from the home by the time Nikki was killed. Swift ultimately left that interview feeling totally deflated. In a matter of just 24 hours, he'd identified two seemingly very good suspects in Robert and Joe. But now, both of those cases seem to be falling apart. Over the next few days, Swift tracked down every lead he could, but every lead he had seemed to hit a dead end. The crime scene unit hadn't found the murder weapon, and the crime scene itself was so bloody that forensic DNA evidence would take months to process. Joe Carter, who was Nikki's second boyfriend, passed his lie detector test, which included discussions around his whereabouts the night before the murder after he had broken up with Nikki at his house. Also, his coworkers the next day at the barbershop confirmed that he had been there all day that day. And on top of that, given the strength of his alibi now, the black car that was seen outside of Nikki's basically couldn't have been his. So Joe was ruled out. Swift interviewed the twins' great-grandmother, Della Frazier, who had been very upset about giving the girls back to Nikki, but even though he didn't think that she literally committed the murder, she did in fact have an alibi for the day of the murder, so she was ruled out as well. Swift even tracked down that red Dodge Avenger with the white hood and missing hubcaps, only to find that it belonged to a hairdressing client of Nikki's who had stopped by Nikki's house after Nikki had missed her appointment. The woman had left when Nikki didn't answer the door. As the days turned to weeks, the case began to go cold. Meanwhile, Nikki was buried, and the people in the gated community where she had lived began locking their doors at night. The twins, Taz and Jazz, were living with Della again, and Nikki's whole family was pressing the police to come up with an answer. What happened to Nikki? But Swift, despite his best efforts, was running out of ideas. But finally, one day in mid-May of 2010, so almost 4 full months after Nikki's murder, Swift got his first piece of good news. He'd walked into the police station that morning to work on a different case altogether, but when he sat down at his desk, he found the forensic reports from Nikki's crime scene. All the blood that had been soaked into the carpet and smeared on the walls had finally been tested for DNA. So had the hair that Swift had found inside of Nikki's mouth. And the results were shocking. When Swift finished reading them, he stood up, walked out of the station, and drove his cruiser to a gas station that was right up the street from Nikki's house. He knew police had not pulled surveillance video from the station because it was too far from the crime scene to be useful, or so they thought. But now, based on the DNA evidence Swift had, he knew that this gas station might be his very best hope to solve the case. When he pulled into the gas station parking lot, he went inside and asked the attendant to speak to the manager. The teenager behind the counter ducked into a back room and then motioned Swift to follow him. Once inside, Swift could barely contain his eagerness as he introduced himself to the manager and then quickly asked if he still had the surveillance footage from the morning of January 13th. This was critical. Swift knew that even if the gas station did have working cameras, the odds of the footage being stored for months were low. But the owner sat down at his computer, clicked around a few files, and then turned to Swift and grinned. He hadn't gotten around to wiping the footage, so everything Swift needed was still here, right in his files. Swift told the manager what specific time frame to search for in the file, and then once the manager had done that, he hit play. And when Swift watched the footage, he knew exactly who had killed Nikki. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews collected over the course of a 4-month investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Whitehead on the morning of January 13th, 2010. Nikki's killer was waiting for her in her own kitchen. Nikki heard the killer moving around from inside her bedroom and walked down the hallway to come see who it was. When she first saw the killer, who was there with an accomplice, Nikki actually was not afraid. She was just annoyed. She told the killer and their accomplice to explain themselves. Then, when they refused, she told them to get out of the house. And it was at that point that they attacked. They leapt onto Nikki's back and began to punch her over and over again. Nikki fought back, biting them, and in the struggle, she bit down on a strand of one of their hairs, which got caught in her teeth. The fight moved from the kitchen to the living room, where Nikki briefly broke free, but the killer picked up a red ceramic vase and threw it at Nikki's head. The vase shattered and Nikki staggered, and that's when the killer grabbed a steak knife from a block on the kitchen counter, and they lunged. They began stabbing Nikki over and over as Nikki screamed. Panicked and now severely injured, Nikki made one final desperate run for safety. She bolted out the front door of her house. And she made it out the front door and down her walkway all the way over to a neighbor's front door, where she rang the bell and began shouting out for help, but her neighbor didn't come. And before she could run to the next house, the killer and their accomplice rushed up behind her and dragged Nikki back inside of her own house without being seen. Back inside, the killer and the accomplice slammed the door shut and threw Nikki up against a wall, where Nikki's braids left a bloody print. Nikki stood for a moment and then crumpled to the floor. And without hesitating, the killer jumped on Nikki and stabbed her again, over and over, until she was dead. After that, the killer and the accomplice dragged Nikki's lifeless body down the hallway and into the bathroom. They ran the water in the tub and then heaved Nikki's body up and over the edge. It was done. They stood there for a minute, just staring down at their work. After that, they cleaned themselves up and then put on their backpacks, slipped out the front door, and began their walk to school. And one of the first buildings they would have to pass on their walk to school was the gas station. And that gas station would have a surveillance camera that would capture them walking 2 full hours later than what they would tell police. It would turn out Nikki's killers were her own 16-year-old twin daughters, Taz and Jazz Whitehead. The twins had told police that they didn't see their mother that morning, but that was a lie. They had gotten up late, and instead of going to school, they had been writing notes to each other and laughing in the kitchen when Nikki had woken up, come in, and asked why they weren't at school. Taz and Jazz were already furious to be back home. They didn't want to be there, they resented their mother and all her strict rules, and for whatever reason, that morning when their mom confronted them, it just felt like the final straw. And so they stabbed her to death, and then went to school like it was just another day. When they got home, they put on this big act of being distraught and horrified by the violent scene they themselves had created, and then ran outside to go tell police. But what the twins didn't realize was that during the vicious attack, one of them got a strand of their hair caught in Nikki's teeth, and then also their own blood mingled with Nikki's. Because Taz and Jazz were identical twins, the police were never actually able to pinpoint which of them did what, but it was very clear they were directly involved in the killing. Also, after this DNA report came back and Swift read it, it prompted him to go to that gas station, which he knew would have been along the walk to the girls' school. And he quickly discovered they had lied to him about what time they had actually walked to school. Also, it was later determined that some of those bite marks on the girls' bodies that police had originally assumed the girls had made themselves out of grief were actually made by their mother during the attack. But the final and perhaps most cold-blooded piece of evidence were the notes the girls had written to each other in their notebook on the morning of the murder. Literally, they wrote these right before they killed their mom. One twin wrote on the last page of the notebook, quote, "She don't care. She's selfish. She needs to go." And the other twin wrote their response, which was, quote, "That's what I think also. She gotta go ASAP." On May 21st, 2010, Taz and Jazz Whitehead were arrested for the murder of their mother, Nikki. They ultimately pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Both twins blamed Nikki for starting the fight and said that she actually attacked them. However, officials do not believe this account. 56-year-old Greg Wolf backed his dusty old Jeep down the driveway and headed towards one of his favorite places, the garden center. Ever since the COVID pandemic started, his work had slowed down, so he had a lot more time on his hands for hobbies like gardening. As he cruised along the winding road, he thought about what he might want to plant. Every year, he liked to mix it up and try a few new fruits, flowers, or vegetables. Greg stopped at a red light and let his mind wander, picturing different layouts for his garden. When the light turned green, Greg put his foot on the gas pedal, but just as he entered the intersection, a black truck came barreling toward him. There was an explosion of crunching metal and shattered glass. Greg felt a blinding pain rip through his spine as his car spun across the road. And then everything went black. Three days later, Greg lay on his stomach in an operating room under fluorescent lights. Just minutes earlier, an anesthesiologist had shot him full of lidocaine to numb his spine for surgery. And as he began to feel the medicine kicking in, it occurred to him that this was actually the first time he had not been in pain since the car accident. Even though Greg had been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash, the impact of the crash had broken a vertebrae in his back. He'd been in the hospital for days while doctors did everything they could to try to stabilize his injury. Once he'd regained consciousness following the crash, doctors told Greg that he was very lucky. The accident could have been much worse. Greg had suffered what's known as a stable fracture. This meant that when his vertebrae cracked, it stayed in the same place rather than being knocked out of alignment. So the nerve endings in Greg's spinal column were not affected. If they had been, Greg could have been paralyzed. To relieve his pain, Greg's doctors had decided to perform a surgery called kyphoplasty, which corrects small fractures like the one in his vertebrae. This was the surgery he was being prepped for right now. A few minutes later, the doctor arrived and greeted Greg and walked him through what was going to happen. Greg was going to remain conscious during the procedure. Then, after Greg acknowledged that he was ready to go, Greg felt the doctor's hands on his back, followed by a dull pressure as a large, hollow needle entered his spine. After the needle was in place, the doctor inserted a balloon-like device into Greg's vertebrae through the needle and gently inflated it until it opened up a small space in the bone. Into this space, the doctor then injected a special type of liquid cement. As the cement settled in the cracked vertebrae, it hardened and bonded against the bone. This would stabilize Greg's spine while staying flexible enough to allow him a full range of motion. And critically, it would also help reduce Greg's pain. Within a week, the doctor said he'd be feeling like his old self. Greg felt the pressure in his back start to fade as the doctor withdrew the needle from his spine. A few minutes later, a nurse came in and wheeled Greg down the hall to a recovery room to rest. As the anesthesia began to wear off, Greg did feel soreness in his spine, but the pain was mild. And after what he'd been through, this felt like a gift. A few hours later, as Greg got dressed and ready to go home, the surgeon came by to check on him. He recommended that Greg only take showers, not baths, for a few days to allow the wound on his back to heal, and he should avoid any heavy lifting for at least a week. But otherwise, his life would be just like before the surgery. Riding home from the hospital with his wife, Greg felt like he had miraculously avoided a tragedy. Now, he could get back to enjoying his life. But, only 7 days later, Greg was back in the emergency room. Everything hurt. His chest, his neck, his jaw. Even turning his head sent shivers of pain rippling through his body. The first few days back at home had been fine. He was able to take walks and cook, even do a little gardening, but on the 5th day, he began to feel this new kind of pain in his chest. Following the doctor's advice, Greg checked his wound from the surgery to see if it was infected. But the wound looked fine, so he decided to turn in early that night and hope he would feel better in the morning. However, over the next 2 days, Greg's pain only spread. Greg tried to relax and avoided doing anything strenuous, but almost any movement, even just turning his head, hurt like crazy. He thought he felt well enough to weed his garden, and that's when the pain suddenly became almost blinding. It was so intense that Greg thought he was having a heart attack. And so now he was lying on a bed in an emergency room, trying not to move a muscle. The pain still flickered through his chest and neck. He could barely breathe. Greg had never felt anything like this. It felt even worse than what he imagined a heart attack was like. Greg just hoped that whatever was happening, it was not too late to fix it. ER doctor Miranda Gibbs was just coming back from lunch when an X-ray technician stopped her in the hallway with an update. There was something seriously wrong with her new patient, Greg Wolf. She followed the technician to his office and looked at Greg's x-rays displayed on his computer. Greg's spine looked fine. His recent kyphoplasty surgery had clearly repaired his cracked vertebrae. But something else she saw in Greg's x-ray disturbed her. Dr. Gibbs pulled out her phone and called the medical imaging department. She told them she needed to book a CT scan for her patient immediately. 2 hours later, the images had been processed and were ready for her inspection. Sitting in her office, Dr. Gibbs struggled to comprehend what she was even looking at. She grabbed the phone and called the ER. She hoped there was a trauma surgeon on duty or somewhere nearby, because Greg Wolf was a pinprick away from disaster. An hour later, Greg was on his back, unconscious. His chest had been surgically opened. A surgeon leaned over him, looking in at Greg's heart. The surgeon maneuvered until he found what he was looking for. A long, thin 4-inch object. It had pierced through the upper right chamber of Greg's heart and also cut into his right lung. This is what Dr. Gibbs had seen in the images of Greg's chest. Now, the strange object was just sitting there, simultaneously poking Greg in the heart and lung. The surgeon steadied himself and carefully gripped the object with his tool. Any abrupt movement could cause a tear in Greg's heart or lung. The damage could be fatal. As he began to pull the object out, the surgeon was surprised at how hard the object was. It was like a stone, pale, pointed, and slightly curved. Little by little, the surgeon pulled the hard little dagger out from Greg's organs, until finally it was free. Examining it in the light, it looked a bit like one of those heavy-duty needles used to repair upholstery or carpet, except it was made of medical-grade cement. It would turn out, during Greg's back surgery, a small splash of the liquid cement had leaked out of his vertebrae into his body. Once there, it hardened into a sliver and basically followed through Greg's bloodstream, eventually reaching his heart. Greg's sudden stabs of pain he was feeling were from the tip of the cement needle piercing his heart. His trouble breathing was the needle literally poking his lung. If he had waited even 24 more hours to go to the ER, the needle could have stabbed him even more deeply and potentially killed him. Fortunately, doctors were able to repair the tear in Greg's heart and his lung, and after being sewn back up, he made a quick recovery. Only 1 month later, Greg Wolf was back in his garden in full health. He had dodged 2 near-death experiences in 2 weeks, and he had no intention of trying for a third. And now here's our second story called Killer Fashion. On a cold, clear afternoon in February of 2000, after a long, bumpy ride through snow-capped mountains, 15-year-old Ahmet Balik stepped off a bus into the city center of Erzurum, Turkey. The urban bustle was a culture shock for a country kid like him. He had spent his whole life in the small Turkish village where he was born, helping his family tend land and herd livestock. But 2 weeks earlier, Ahmet's uncle had found him a job in a textile factory in Erzurum. So here he was, surrounded by cars and buses and people, with businesses and cafes stretching down every block. It was a lot for Ahmet to process, but he was thrilled to be in this new environment and to start this exciting new chapter. He grabbed his bag from the bus's luggage compartment and headed straight for his new job. As he walked through the city, Ahmet had to stop every few blocks to catch his breath. Erzurum was a high, mountainous city, and so the air was thinner up there. He could feel the difference in his lungs. Eventually, Ahmet found the factory, walked inside, and introduced himself. His boss gave him a quick tour of the facility. As they walked around, Ahmet saw long rows of industrial looms and conveyor belts loaded with fabric, and he also saw another part of the building that was filled with workers hunched over sewing machines. Then, Ahmet followed his boss to a back area of the factory where narrow pallets were clustered in a corner. The man told him that that was actually where many of the workers without families would sleep, since the hours were long and the factory was a good distance from most residential areas. Now, Ahmet really needed this job to work, and he would do whatever it took. So he smiled and tossed his bag on one of the pallets and followed his boss to begin his training. 4.5 years later, in July of 2004, Ahmet wiped the sweat from his face as he paced the crowded waiting room of a government hospital. He was 19 years old, but he felt much older. His life at the factory had been a whirlwind, getting up at dawn, shuffling to the assembly line, then sewing and finishing garments until dark. He and a couple other workers shared an apartment near the city center, but some nights he was too tired to make the walk back. So on those nights, he just curled up on the floor of the factory until it was time to get up and start the next day's shift. And before long, the late nights and early mornings began to take their toll. His sleep got worse, which only made the days feel longer. Ahmet also developed a bad cough, and gradually it got so severe that he began waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. The exhaustion also affected his appetite, and he started losing weight. And this only made Ahmet feel weaker and more fatigued. It was a vicious cycle. A year earlier, in the fall of 2003, his condition had gotten so bad that he began making mistakes at work. He confused the measurements of seams and hems. He skipped entire steps of the production process. In November of that year, some shops complained about the quality of their orders, and the errors were traced back to Ahmet. When Ahmet's boss confronted him about the problem, Ahmet tried to pass it off as an accident, but Ahmet's boss could tell something deeper was wrong. So he removed Ahmet from the work schedule until his health improved. Without a job, Ahmet felt lost. His small amount of savings quickly dwindled. Ahmet tried to find other work, but Erzurum was full of young men who were hungry for similar jobs. And since Ahmet looked visibly ill, most employers turned him away. Ahmet had been able to scrape by on savings through the winter, but by the spring of 2004, Ahmet was broke. His roommates tried to be understanding, but told Ahmet that he would have to move out if he couldn't keep up with his share of the rent. And so, if Ahmet couldn't find a job soon, he would soon have no choice but to move back to his family's home in the country. Unfortunately, Ahmet's time away from the factory did not improve his health. He was still sleeping poorly, he felt run down, dizzy, and exhausted, and then one scorching summer morning in July, Ahmet woke up so out of breath that he couldn't even make it to a job interview he had booked. He realized something serious might be wrong with him. So Ahmet took a cold shower, threw on clothes, and dragged himself to the government hospital across town. Now here he was, weak and lightheaded, pacing a waiting room full of sick people. An hour later, a nurse called Ahmet's name. He was taken to a treatment room where a tired-looking doctor listened while Ahmet described his symptoms. When he was done, the doctor told Ahmet he most likely had tuberculosis, commonly called TB, a contagious bacterial disease of the lungs. For hundreds of years, TB had been one of the world's deadliest diseases. But thanks to the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, it was now a very treatable illness. The doctor guessed that Ahmet had caught TB in the factory, since the disease spreads easily in confined spaces. All it takes is being near the wrong cough or sneeze. The doctor said that most likely the disease had lingered in his lungs ever since. Ahmet was surprised by the diagnosis, especially considering the doctor didn't actually run any tests. But it seemed like an obvious enough explanation, and he was honestly just relieved to have an explanation at all for his trouble breathing and fatigue. And so the doctor prescribed Ahmet medication that would stop the TB from being contagious within 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, all of Ahmet's symptoms would be gone. Ahmet was thrilled. If the doctor was right, he could be back in the factory within a month, making his full wages again. He wouldn't have to move back home after all. Even better, he would finally stop coughing and be able to sleep through the entire night. 1 month later, in August of 2004, a pulmonologist named Dr. Yusuf Kaya went to meet a new patient at the Ataturk University Clinic in Erzurum. The patient was a 19-year-old factory worker named Ahmet. He reported having trouble breathing, a painful cough, and intense fatigue. As soon as Dr. Kaya stepped into the treatment room, he could tell from the teenager's face alone that something was deeply wrong. Ahmet's skin looked waxy and sickly. It looked like he'd barely slept in days. Ahmet explained to Dr. Kaya that he had been taking TB antibiotics for a full month, but hadn't seen any sign of improvement. He felt weak and run down, and no matter how deeply he tried to breathe, he just couldn't get enough air. Dr. Kaya found this very worrying. If Ahmet had TB, then the antibiotics definitely should have helped him by now. But since his body was not responding, Dr. Kaya wondered what else might be causing Ahmet's symptoms. The doctor placed a stethoscope on Ahmet's chest. The teenager's heartbeat was normal, however, his breathing sounded shallow. Dr. Kaya told Ahmet that he wanted to run some tests to figure out why the TB medication was not working. He proposed starting with an X-ray of Ahmet's chest, followed by a full-body CT scan to provide a more detailed 3D rendering of Ahmet's organs. After that, Dr. Kaya suggested doing a bronchoscopy, which uses a thin, illuminated tube to examine the lungs and airways. Separately, he also wanted to test Amet's blood, mucus, and saliva for disease or infection. Amet told Dr. Kaya that his number one goal was getting back to his job at the factory. So whatever was necessary to make that happen, Dr. Kaya should do it. A few days later, after all the tests had been performed, Dr. Kaya opened a link on his computer to inspect Amet's results. And what he saw made him very concerned. Amet's chest x-ray looked speckled, particularly in his lungs. This indicated the presence of small foreign objects in Amet's lungs that shouldn't be there. His CT scan was more detailed. In addition to the foreign objects, it showed small growths in his lungs known as micronodules, which are often caused by respiratory illnesses or infections. And a culture test of his phlegm confirmed that Amet did not have TB. Dr. Kaya had suspected this when Amet's TB treatment didn't have any effect, but it was a relief to see it medically proven. But even so, ruling out TB didn't get Dr. Kaya any closer to figuring out what was causing Amet's symptoms. The cumulative picture provided by Amet's tests indicated that there was some sort of serious infection in his lungs. It just wasn't clear what that might be. So Dr. Kaya canceled Amet's TB medication and replaced it with a more general antibiotic. Dr. Kaya hoped this would ease Amet's symptoms, but he knew antibiotics wouldn't fix anything. Until he identified the infection in Amet's lungs, it wouldn't go away, and it very well might get worse. He just didn't know how much worse. Amet was already struggling to breathe, and less oxygen in his lungs meant less oxygen to his brain. And if that trend continued, things could get very bad very quickly. A few weeks later, Dr. Kaya was scanning the paperwork of the clinic's latest patients when something caught his eye. It was the intake form of a young man named Ali. He was 18, only a year younger than Amet, and suffering from very similar symptoms. Struggling to breathe, dry mouth, bad cough, unusual fatigue. Dr. Kaya decided to pay him a visit at the clinic. Maybe Ali could provide a clue as to what was making Amet so sick. After introducing himself, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to describe the history of his symptoms. And right away, one detail surprised him. Ali worked at the same garment factory as Amet. Dr. Kaya wondered why two otherwise healthy young men would have breathing issues or lung infections at their age. Neither of them smoked, and they spent their days doing physical labor, which in theory should have made them stronger, not weaker. Taking a seat by Ali's bed, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to walk him through a regular day at the factory. The jobs he did, the machines he used, what he ate, all of it. Ali explained that he started at the factory doing heavy labor, like loading and unloading fabric from the trucks to the machines and back. But over time, he was trained to do more skilled work, putting the finishing touches on garments before they were shipped to shops around the world. Ali and Amet's factory produced contemporary clothing for the latest fashion trends of the 2000s. Some of their factory's techniques were extremely new to the industry, and they sounded pretty strange to the doctor. But as Ali described his responsibilities, Dr. Kaya began to get an idea. And by the end of their chat, Dr. Kaya felt confident that he actually knew what was happening to both Ali and Amet. However, to be certain, he would need to examine samples of Ali and Amet's lung tissue under a microscope, and so he ordered lung biopsies for both men. Days later, the lung tissue samples confirmed Dr. Kaya's hunch. Both men were suffering from silicosis, a disease more commonly found in miners than garment factory workers. It's a lung disease caused by breathing silica, which is a common mineral in sand, gravel, clay, granite, and other rocks. Dr. Kaya had diagnosed cases of silicosis before, but only in workers who spent their days in tunnels or moving heavy stone materials and breathing in all kinds of rock dust. He would never have thought textile factory workers would have silicosis, since their product was fabric, not rock. But fashion tastes had changed in Europe and America in the early 2000s. One of the most popular and profitable items that Amet and Ali's factory produced was something called distressed jeans, and making them involved a lot of rock dust. To create the hip, faded denim look, workers used a high-pressure air compressor to blast sand up and down the legs of a pair of jeans. The silica particles in the sand gradually shredded the denim, giving the jeans a worn-in, weathered look. Like a lot of factories in Turkey at the time, Ahmet and Ali's workplace was crowded and lacked proper ventilation. This meant the silica particles stayed in the air long after the jeans were sandblasted. And so Ahmet and Ali breathed these particles in all day. And then at night, if they slept on the factory floor, they would continue to breathe in the silica during their sleep. Over time, the tiny crystals of silica scar and harden the delicate tissues in the lungs, making them less effective at processing oxygen. That's why the men's breathing became increasingly shallow. Sadly, silicosis damage is permanent, and it often leads to other respiratory illnesses. Lung cancer is a common outcome, and there is no cure. Even after Dr. Kaya identified Ahmet and Ali's condition, their health steadily worsened, and in 2008, both young men died from silicosis complications. And they were not alone either. 4 other workers at the same factory died as well, and 16 others suffered debilitating lung damage. In March of the following year, Turkey's Ministry of Health banned denim sandblasting, and thankfully, sandblasted jeans quickly fell out of fashion.
At 12:20 a.m. on August 17, 2020, a police sergeant named Kevin Bingham was sitting inside of his cruiser in a parking lot in Scottsdale, Arizona with the windows rolled down when he heard a strange sound. He couldn't place exactly what it was. At first, it sort of sounded like a woman screaming, but then it kind of morphed into more of like a screech, like a cat would make in a fight. But at the same time, this sound was sort of echoey, almost like it was in a cave or something. But Sergeant Bingham is looking around him, and there's a school and a baseball field, there's houses and apartment buildings. I mean, he's in a typical American neighborhood. There's no caves anywhere near him. But regardless of where specifically this noise was originating from, what was clear to Sergeant Bingham is that whoever or whatever was making this noise sounded like they needed help, and so he decided he would go investigate. So Sergeant Bingham left the parking lot, turned right onto the road, and began driving roughly in the direction of the sound. But again, remember, the sound is kind of echoey, it's very hard to place where it's coming from. But as he continued driving down this road, Sergeant Bingham realized the noise was getting louder, and so he must be getting closer. And so just ahead of Sergeant Bingham at the end of this road is this huge health club. There's a big fitness center, and then behind it, kind of attached to it, was an outdoor pool area, and then surrounding the pool area was a 12-foot tall brick fence. And so Sergeant Bingham thought, based on the proximity to this noise, maybe the sound, the screeching sound, is coming from somewhere in this health club. And so Sergeant Bingham drives up to the health club, parks his cruiser, he gets out, turns on his flashlight, and right away he hears more screeching, and immediately Sergeant Bingham can tell it's coming from inside of the enclosed pool area, behind that 12-foot tall wall. And so Sergeant Bingham can't see into the pool area, but again, he can tell, whatever it is, it's in there. And also, at the same time he's kind of pinpointing the sound, he can tell that this noise, this screeching sound, really doesn't sound like an animal. It sounds like a person. And so Sergeant Bingham runs up to the brick wall and he listens really intently to see if maybe in addition to the screeching sound, if he can hear, splashing sounds or some other activity inside of the pool area that would kind of give away what's actually happening. Maybe somebody snuck in after hours and now they're struggling to swim in one of these pools. But as he strained to listen, all he heard over and over again was the screeching sound, but nothing else. There's no splashing, there's no other activity, it's just the screeching sound. And so as Sergeant Bingham was wondering how he was going to get into this pool area to see what was going on, he looked over and he saw there were 2 gym cleaners coming out of the fitness center. And so Sergeant Bingham ran over to them and he asked them, hey, are you the only 2 that are working in this health club right now? Or is there somebody out in the pool area? And the cleaners looked at Sergeant Bingham and just shook their head and said, no, we are the only ones working right now, and we've been listening to that screeching sound too. We don't know what it is. And then shortly after they said this to Sergeant Bingham, suddenly the noises, the screeching sounds, changed. And it went from just being these guttural, high-pitched screeches to somebody yelling out a single word: help. And so the second Sergeant Bingham heard this, he grabbed his radio and called for backup. About 2 minutes later, another officer showed up, and right away the cleaners opened up the doors to the fitness center, and Bingham and the other officer ran inside. They cut through the huge gym to the very back, where there were doors that led out to the pool area. And this pool area is huge. It's actually the biggest part of this health club. And so they open up the doors, they go outside, and both officers are expecting to, see this person that's calling out for help. But instead, once they get outside, it's eerily silent and there's absolutely no activity anywhere. Right in front of them are these two pools. There's this huge lap pool, no one's in it, the water is calm, and then next to it is another pool, a smaller pool that has a water playground right in the middle of it, but that one as well is devoid of people and totally calm. And so the officers are looking at each other like, where is this person that clearly was calling for help a second ago? But just then, the cries for help began again, and this time they were able to kind of pinpoint where it was coming from. It was coming from a third pool, kind of in the back of the pool area, beyond these two pools and beyond some cabanas. There was this third shallow pool with two water slides going into it. And from the sound of these screeches, it sounded very much like this person must be in or near these slides. And so at this point, Sergeant Bingham became a little bit skeptical that whoever this was really needed help. He felt like it was more likely that, somebody had just snuck in after hours who maybe was high on drugs or mentally ill, and now they're just kind of causing a scene inside one of the slides. Or maybe it's somebody who snuck in just to play a prank, to screw with the cops and act like they were in trouble when they really weren't. And so Sergeant Bingham looks at the other officer and they kind of are like, okay, let's go see what's going on here. And they make their way over to the slides. And when they got there, there's two slides. There's one slide, which is blue, and it's an open top, so if you were sliding down it, you'd be visible the entire time you're on the slide. And there's nobody on this slide, so whoever is making these sounds, they're not on or in the blue slide. But the other slide, the red slide, was a tube slide, and so if you were going down this slide, you'd be hidden inside the tube. And so both officers are thinking, okay, the person who's yelling out for help has got to be inside of this red slide. And so the two officers went to the base of the red slide and they looked up inside of it, but they couldn't see anyone. But it was a big enough slide that it was possible they were, just beyond their line of sight. And so Sergeant Bingham just yelled in like, hey, are you okay? And the person did respond to this, but they didn't respond with words. They just responded with more screeching. And so Sergeant Bingham tells the other officer, hey, stay right here at the foot of the slide. I'm gonna go up and go down the slide. We'll meet in the middle, we'll find this person, and we'll get them out of here. And so the other officer stays put, and Sergeant Bingham goes to the stairs. He makes his way up to the top of the platform that led to both slides. He went to the top of the red slide, and he looked down into it, but he couldn't see anybody. But again, the slide was long enough. It's possible that from both sides, looking up and looking down, your line of sight would not allow you to see the person right in the middle. And so Sergeant Bingham yelled into the slide like, hey, I'm coming down and my partner's coming up. We're gonna find you here. Like, if you're in there, go down, get out of the slide. But again, the response they got was not words, it was just more guttural screaming and moaning. And so feeling kind of annoyed, Sergeant Bingham gets his flashlight and aims it straight ahead of him, and he begins slowly making his way down the slide. And at the same time, his partner at the bottom began making his way up the slide. And so as they're doing it, both officers are yelling like, hey, if you're in here, we're coming in, like, let's go, you gotta get out of here. But again, all they're hearing is more screaming. And as the officers get closer and closer to the middle, they're expecting to see someone. But then suddenly, both officers come face to face right in the middle of this red slide, and there's nobody there. It's just them. And so at this point, both officers are totally freaked out. This did not make sense. They've been listening to this person screaming out for the last few minutes, and it sounded so much like they were in this slide. Like, how could they not be? And so Sergeant Bingham and the other officer get out of the slide, and they start screaming out for this person, like, hey, tell us where you are. But in response, they just continued to get more and more desperate sounding screeches. And it sounded like the screeches really were in this red slide, or at least somewhere really close by. But there's no one anywhere near them. There's nowhere for this person to be. It didn't make any sense. And so having no other ideas, Sergeant Bingham went over to the blue slide, the open top slide that very clearly nobody is on, but he hopped on it and thought, let me just check. And he began going up the slide. Now, this slide was not a straight slide. It actually went around in the middle like a corkscrew. And so as Sergeant Bingham began walking up the slide began to turn, and so he began walking along this corkscrew section of the slide on the way to the top. And about halfway up the corkscrew section, when he's basically halfway up the slide, Sergeant Bingham just stopped and just kind of scanned around, because now he's at a higher position, a better vantage point across this outdoor area, and he's looking all around him, despite still hearing these screams coming out of what feels like right where he is. He doesn't see anybody. But then, right as he's about to continue going up the slide, something catches his eye just below him. And he stops and he kind of leans over the edge of this blue slide and looks straight down, and he could not believe what he saw.
It would turn out earlier that night, so right before 12:20 a.m., which is when Sergeant Bingham first heard that screeching sound, a 32-year-old man named Ryan Kelly, who was naked and high on meth, snuck into the pool area. He climbed over that wall, jumped inside, and eventually he found his way over to the stairs that led up to the platform that allowed you to go down the red and blue slides. And once he got up there, instead of, sliding down the slide, he began walking down that blue slide, the open top slide that has a corkscrew section in the middle. He began walking down it, and when he got about halfway down it, around the part where it began to corkscrew, he stopped and at some point must have looked around him and noticed there was a support beam basically running from the ground straight up, basically as high as the blue slide was, where there were all these arms branching off of it that supported the corkscrew section of the slide. It was just holding the corkscrew up. And from where Ryan was standing, he would have had the ability to see the top of this beam. And he would have seen that the top of this beam was open. It was a round beam with about an 18-inch diameter across, and to any sane person, it would be very apparent that you're not supposed to go inside of this support beam, but Ryan, being high on meth, decided he would go inside of this support beam. He climbed up to the top of it, and then wedged his feet into this narrow opening, and Ryan's a pretty skinny guy, he's naked, he's slick with sweat, and he began lowering himself into this pipe, this hollow pipe that goes all the way to the ground. And after he got his feet in there and his legs in there, he's forcing himself down, he finally got most of his torso in, and then he would have realized his hands would not be able to fit unless he put them over his head. And so he put his arms over his head and just continued to wiggle himself down into this pipe. And at some point, probably around the time that his shoulders cleared the pipe, he kind of slipped pretty quickly about halfway down the pipe. Not to the ground, basically suspended right in the middle of this tiny, tight pipe. Now, we don't know for sure if Ryan intended to get out of this pipe at some point, but once he was about halfway down the pipe with his arms up over his head, there was absolutely no way he could get himself out again. There was just nowhere to pull or anything. He's completely wedged, barely able to breathe, and on top of that, he's in Arizona. It's one of the hottest places in the world, and on top of that, they were experiencing a heat wave, and his body, his naked body, is pressed all against the inside of this metal pipe that conducts heat. And so he's basically in this really tight space, cooking alive, and there's no way to get out. And so at some point, as Ryan is likely realizing that he is completely screwed here, and he's beginning to literally cook to death, he began trying to scream out for help, but he was likely in so much pain, and also again under the influence of meth, that he couldn't quite yell out words. He just let out those horrible screeching sounds, and those were the noises that Sergeant Bingham heard. But then when Sergeant Bingham and his partner got into the pool area, they were able to identify roughly where Ryan was stuck, but Ryan, again, couldn't make words. He's so messed up, he's in so much pain that he just continued to scream, and because he was in that pipe, it kind of created this weird echoey phenomenon where when he would scream out, his voice would come out of the pipe and almost kind of get thrown around the park. That's why Sergeant Bingham and the other officer couldn't quite figure out where he was, and at one point it sounded like he was in that red slide, when obviously he wasn't. And so finally, at some point, Sergeant Bingham walked up the blue slide. He's halfway up, he's hearing Ryan screaming, and he turns and he looks down, and from his perspective where he was standing, he was looking down into that pipe. And looking up at him inside of this pipe is Ryan, arms up over his head, wide-eyed, screeching, trying to be saved. But unfortunately for Ryan, his rescue was a very technically difficult thing to pull off. He was too far down the pipe for anyone to reach him to pull him up, and when they threw a rope down to him inside of the pipe, Ryan was too weak to grab onto the rope. And so for hours and hours, rescue crews tried to get Ryan out. The whole time Ryan is panicking and screaming and cooking to death basically. They couldn't get him out, and so finally at the 7-hour mark after he was found, they had to bring in a crane, and they had to fully dismantle the slide and pull that pipe out of the ground. But unfortunately, by that point, it was too late for Ryan. He had passed away. An autopsy would show that ultimately what killed Ryan was the combination of the meth in his bloodstream and the extreme heat he was exposed to inside of that pipe.
As many of you may know, the biggest event ever to come out of Ballen Studios is fast approaching. From September 26th to October 20th, I will be on tour. I'll be visiting 15 cities across the United States, telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories live and in person. Last year we did one show. It was a sold-out show in Austin, Texas, to kind of trial run this concept, and it's basically just me on stage telling stories, and people loved it, and there was huge demand for more, and so here we are, doing 15 more shows. Tickets for these 15 shows have been selling very quickly, but there are still tickets available if you act basically right now. All you have to do is go to tour.ballenstudios.com, find the show that is, nearest you or whichever one you're interested in, click on the link, and if there are tickets still available, you can buy them through that link. And if you're lucky, there might even be some VIP tickets left, which will give you access to meet this guy, if that's of interest to you. Also, just for our VIP ticket holders, bring your copy of our graphic novel and I'll sign it for you when we meet. And so the way you get the book is either you have already pre-ordered it or you can buy a copy at the theater. We'll be selling them on site. Again, I'm going to be on tour from September 26th to October 20th, telling stories in person. It's going to be great. If you want to go, there are still tickets, but they're going quick. Just go to tour.ballenstudios.com and get your tickets today. Okay, back to the stories. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his 3rd deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Kurt, along with 7 people under his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Kurt called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Kurt. But ultimately, they got it done, and Kurt cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Kurt undid the 3 dogs on his hatch and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Kurt crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch. He undid the 3 dogs, he opened up the hatch, and then using a remote controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Kurt could inspect them through the scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Kurt just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Kurt was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Kurt, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Kurt's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Kurt. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Kurt. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower 2 dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the 2 lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Kurt could have gotten inside of the scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside, and so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up the scavenger air recovery hatches. And it wasn't this sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Kurt. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower two dogs, and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Kurt's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman, completely independently, had gone around to the back of the scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it, and he unlocked the three dogs. He opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all three dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the scavenger air unit, and he said, "Hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Kurt wasn't in there, and you just checked, right? He's not in there?" And the foreman said, "Yeah, no one's in there, it's all good." And so the two of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag, they just left. The search for Kurt continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority, and he said, "Hey, we're down someone, can you please send someone out to look around?" And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Kurt. And so finally 9:30 came around, and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave, even though they had no idea where Kurt was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Kurt must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier, when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame, because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me, and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone, even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found, and so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch, and he heard the sound of them locking all three 3 dogs. At this point, you gotta figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is gonna become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's gonna happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat up until Kurt was cooked alive. Midday on June 10th, 1981, an Italian man and his 6-year-old son walked to the edge of their property in Frascati, which is an area in Italy known as the hub of Rome's local wine industry. The father needed to repair a section of their fence, and his son, who he said had the soul of Huckleberry Finn, wanted to tag along. But as soon as the work began, Alfredo just wanted to go play in the vineyards, and so he ran off. And the father didn't think much of it because his son always played in the vineyards and just figured he would see him back at the house. When the father finished up the work around 7 p.m. and walked back into his house, he was surprised that Alfredo wasn't there. And so he asked his wife, have you seen our son? And she said, no, can you go out and find him? Because dinner's going to be on the table any minute. So the father goes back outside, expecting to see Alfredo come running out from behind some hiding place, but he doesn't. And he yells out for his son and doesn't get a response. And so he begins walking his property and yelling for Alfredo, and he's not finding him. And so after 2 hours of looking, he finally just calls the police. The police arrive, and initially it's just a couple of officers with flashlights, and they spend about 2 hours looking as well. They can't find him, so they call in backup in the form of officers with sniffer dogs, and the dogs began searching the property for another 3 hours, and they still couldn't find him. A little after midnight, the fire department, known in Italy as the fire brigade, they joined in as well. Shortly thereafter, a fire brigade officer was on the edge of Alfredo's property when he discovered a small hole in the ground. It would turn out Alfredo's neighbor had dug an illegal well, which was a common practice at the time, and generally, if you dug one of these wells and you struck water, you would report the well. But if you dug down and you didn't find water, you would just cover it up with a girder and you wouldn't tell anyone. In this case, however, the hole the officer was looking at did not have anything covering it. And so he knelt down and he yelled Alfredo's name into this hole, and at first he didn't hear anything. Then he yelled again, and he heard Alfredo yell back for his mother. Alfredo must not have seen the opening as he was running around playing, and he fell feet first into an 80-meter deep shaft. After Alfredo was found, the fire brigade took over rescue efforts, and so additional fire brigade units were called to help. But as soon as those additional units showed up, the captains of the different units began arguing with each other because it wasn't really clear how they were going to get him out. And unfortunately, the fire brigade immediately made a very bad decision. They decided to lower a plank into the shaft attached by a rope that he could grab onto, and they could pull him out that way. But when they lowered it at about 24 meters, the plank got stuck inside of the tunnel. And when they yanked on the rope to try to free it, the rope came off of the plank, but the plank remained wedged in the tunnel, blocking the tunnel. By the following morning, TV crews had swarmed the area, and one of them offered up a two-way microphone that could be lowered down into the hole so they could talk directly to Alfredo. When the microphone was finally lowered down next to his face, he was crying and pleading for them to get him out and that he missed his mother. Amateur spelunker Tullio Barnaby, a 23-year-old, had come over and joined the vigil that night. The plank plan shocked him for its foolishness, and so too did the scene. It was like everyone and no one was in charge. The well opening had been widened in hopes that a very skinny person would be willing to be lowered down to remove the piece of wood that was obstructing the tunnel. And since Tullio was a spelunker and was comfortable in confined spaces and was pretty skinny, he volunteered himself to do it. As he was lowered down, he quickly realized the inside of this tunnel was not a straight shot. It was more like a corkscrew. And so because of its windy nature, he was not able to get down to the wood. And so he signaled to go back up again. And when he reached the surface, he didn't have the wood in hand, but he told the fire brigade that because of the windy nature, it's unlikely Alfredo fell all the way to the bottom. He's probably stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a good thing. But we have to be really careful as we pull him out that we don't do anything that unintentionally causes him to slip farther into the hole. Tullio's suggestion was they go out and recruit professional spelunkers to be involved in the rescue because they would understand how to get someone out of such a tight space so far down in the ground. But the fire brigade disregarded his advice and said, we don't have enough time for that. At 6 a.m. the next day, about 12 hours after Alfredo's fallen into the swell, the fire brigade would make another very poor decision. They decided they would drill down another hole parallel to the one Alfredo was in, and they would drill down past the point they believed Alfredo was, at which point they would turn and drill laterally and connect to the tunnel Alfredo's in, grabbing Alfredo, pulling him across, and back up the new tunnel. Tullio objected, and he said the vibrations from this drill are almost certainly going to dislodge the boy and cause him to slip farther into the tunnel. But once again, the fire brigade did not listen to him. The drilling began about 2 hours later, and by that afternoon, Alfredo's plight had become major national news, with every single TV station playing a 24/7 live broadcast of the well, watching the drilling take place. Even the Italian president made a special trip to the well to see how it was going. But the drilling was very slow, and Alfredo, he had that microphone next to his head, and he was crying half the time, and the other times he was just pleading with them to get him out and saying he was cold or that he was tired, and the rescuers would say, "We're going to be down there to get you, don't fall asleep, we're going to get you out of there." Finally, after 36 hours, they had drilled all the way down to their intended stopping point, and they began drilling across into Alfredo's well. When they finally broke into Alfredo's well, rescuers rushed in with flashlights and looked up and looked down, and there was no sign of Alfredo. And they called it up to the top, and they said, "He's not here." And then all of a sudden, they heard a faint voice coming from all the way down at the bottom of the well. The vibrations from all of the drilling had indeed caused Alfredo to slip all the way to the very bottom. They estimated he was approximately 30 meters below this new parallel tunnel, and at that depth, the temperatures would be freezing. And so now Alfredo, on top of everything else, was facing hypothermia. They quickly lowered the microphone again down to Alfredo, and they told him, "We're going to get you out of there. We're sorry we dropped you, but we're going to get you." And Alfredo's voice came back weak. He was tired, he was sore, he was freezing, he was crying. It was like the situation was just getting so much worse by the second, and rescuers knew they had to get to him probably in the next couple of hours, or that was it. And so another skinny man volunteered to go down into the hole, and they lowered him, and he would go all the way down to the bottom where Alfredo was. And he would call up that he found him and that Alfredo was alive. But Alfredo was stuck waist deep in this mud that the guy could not pull him out of. And so every time he'd begin to raise him slightly out of the mud, he'd lose his grip and he would fall back into the mud, going deeper into the mud each time. And after the 7th time of not being able to do it, Alfredo was getting dangerously close to being neck deep in the mud. And so the guy had to be pulled back out again. As soon as he was pulled back out again, more men volunteered themselves to go in there and try to yank him out, but many of them were not able to even get down to Alfredo. They would get stuck along the way. A couple did get to Alfredo, but they said his condition was worsening, he was weak, he wasn't even assisting, trying to get pulled out. It was clear they were reaching the end. Finally, at 6:36 a.m. on Saturday, so 2.5 days after Alfredo fell in, they could not get him to respond on that two-way microphone. And so they sent down a sonar probe, and they could not detect a heartbeat, and doctors declared him dead. The next day, liquid nitrogen was poured into the hole to preserve the body, and then 31 days later, they were finally able to extract it. After it was all over, the 25 million plus people that watched this take place live on television were crushed with what happened to Alfredo. There was a general sense that lots of people let this poor child down, which led to his death. But the person who was ultimately held accountable for it was the neighbor who had illegally dug the well. And so the neighbor was charged with manslaughter and was sent to jail, but their sentence is not publicly available online. If you hop in a boat just off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and you cruise eastward, after about 7 hours, depending on your speed and the weather, you would come across this massive man-made structure jutting up out of the ocean. It looks like a cross between a construction site and a corporate office building sitting on top of 100-foot-tall metal stilts. It's called MrBallen, and it is an offshore oil rig, and it will remain in place until all the oil has been sucked up in that area. The people who work, often for weeks or months at a time, on rigs like MrBallen are known as roughnecks, and they have one of, if not the most dangerous job in the world. All exterior surfaces on these offshore rigs are always slick, either with water or oil, and so there is a constant risk of falling, sometimes hundreds of feet. If you're up on a higher platform, you could fall to a lower platform, which could be fatal, or you could fall clean off the rig all the way to the ocean 100 plus feet below. If If you add in some bad windy weather, the risk of falling increases tenfold. Also, the crude oil that these roughnecks are drilling for is highly combustible, and so fires are a huge concern as well. And if that wasn't risky enough, there's also this phenomenon known as a blowout, where basically the oil well that the drill is actually drilling into will just explode. Now, all rigs have some sort of mitigating equipment to try to save themselves in case this occurs, but in reality, if it happens and you are unfortunately near the drill when it happens, you are likely to be killed or maimed. While the downsides of working on an oil rig are fairly obvious, the upsides are too, namely, your pay is fantastic. In 2000, a 41-year-old father of two named Gordon Moffat was a roughneck working on the Magellan. His primary job was to perform maintenance on the drill. Now, these offshore rigs work great most of the time, but they do have a habit of breaking down fairly often. And for a drilling company, anytime they are not sucking out crude oil, they're losing money. And so it was just a known thing when you worked on one of these rigs that as soon as there is an issue that causes the drill to stop working, it must be fixed immediately. Whether it's day, night, horrible weather, good weather, it didn't matter. It had to be fixed right away. And so on the night of October 9th that year, Gordon had just gotten back to his quarters to end the day when he got a call on his radio that he was actually needed to come back out to fix a problem that had stopped the drill. Now, Gordon was a seasoned roughneck and he had grown quite accustomed to these late night calls to go out and fix things. And so he wasn't annoyed. He just put his stuff back on, turned around, and he headed out the door. When Gordon got to the main deck, which is this wide open metal platform right in the middle of the rig where the drill actually passes down through it on its way to the ocean, when he got to the main deck, he was met by some of his co-workers who told him where he would need to go. The cabling that needed fixing was located right below the main deck. However, it was not accessible from the main deck. In order for Gordon to get to it, he would need to go down to the next lowest platform from the main deck. Basically, he would need to hop in an elevator and go down one floor. And from this lower deck, the crew on the main deck would lower down a harness attached to a long wire. They would feed it down through this hole in the main deck platform called a mouse hole. It was about 10 inches across, and they would feed it down, and he would grab the harness, he would put it on, and then he would signal up to the main deck crew who could literally see him through this mouse hole. They would turn around and they would signal somebody called the hoist operator, and they were located above the main deck, slightly back. They couldn't actually see Gordon, so they're relying on communications with the people on the main deck. And the hoist operator would start their winch, and a winch basically reels in the wire that was connected to the harness that was on Gordon. And so once the hoist operator was informed, he'd turn on the winch, and then Gordon would be raised up until he could access these cables, and then he'd do his maintenance and be lowered back down, and that would be it. Now, Gordon and the crew had done maintenance using this winch system many times before, so this was a very routine fix. So Gordon made his way from the main deck down to the slightly lower deck, and he looked up at the mouse hole, and he watched as the main deck crew members lowered the harness with the wire attached to it down through the mouse hole. And so Gordon grabbed the harness, he put it around his waist, and he secured it. And after he was sure it was on correctly, he signaled up to the crew on the main deck that he was ready to start, and they in turn turned around. They flagged the hoist operator who started the winch. And so very slowly, Gordon was lifted off the platform he was standing on, and he was brought up after several minutes, all the way up about 10 feet to access these cables. And as soon as he was parallel with them, he waved to the main deck crew, who were not far from him at this point, and he said, "I'm good." And so they turned around, they told the hoist operator, who stopped the winch. And so Gordon got his tools out and he began working on these cables, and the whole time he's trying to stay in one place because the wind is whipping through and he's kind of dangling and swinging around. And then eventually he finishes the repair, the cables are good, and so he signals the crew on the main deck through the mouse hole that he was good to go. "You can lower me back down now." And so the main deck crew, they turn, they wave to the hoist operator to go ahead and lower Gordon, and the hoist operator, he gives the thumbs up and he starts the winch. However, the hoist operator accidentally forgot to switch the direction of the winch. And so when he started it again, instead of the winch spooling the wire out and lowering Gordon, it continued to reel the wire in, pulling Gordon upward. Now, the winch did not move very quickly, and so it wasn't like Gordon is rocketing up towards the mouse hole. hole. However, this problem was immediately recognized by Gordon and the main deck crew, and so they're frustrated. They're yelling up at the hoist operator saying, "Stop, stop, stop, reverse the winch." They're all waving and flagging this guy down, but the hoist operator, after he had hit start on the winch, had just kind of turned around, because this is a routine thing they've done a million times before, and so he's not looking at the crew on the main deck, so he has no idea what's going on. And it was so windy and loud that night on board the rig that he couldn't hear their cries, and so the winch just continued to reel in the wire, slowly raising Gordon closer and closer to the mouse hole. Now, Gordon could not get out of his harness unless he was on the platform below, so there was no way to escape the situation he was in. And so Gordon, after a few seconds of this not stopping and him continuing upward, he starts screaming. He's not annoyed anymore, he's terrified, and so is the crew on the main deck. They are now frantically screaming at the hoist operator to stop the winch, but nothing is working. And so one of the main deck crew members, sensing that they need to do something different to get this guy's attention, he runs away from where the mouse hole is to this nearby phone, and this phone is connected up to the hoist operator station, and he picks it up and it starts dialing. Up in the hoist operator station, he's still not paying attention when the phone rings. He grabs the phone, puts it to his ear, and immediately he's hit with screams to stop the winch. And so the hoist operator, totally confused, whips around and hits stop on the winch, but it was too late. Just a few moments earlier, Gordon had finally been pulled all the way up right to the entrance of the underside of this mouse hole. And as he reached this hole, he tried to position himself in a vertical position so that maybe he could slip his upper body into the hole and he could just kind of slide through the hole. He'd still be hurt by it, but it would limit the damage. However, because of his harness being on his waist right in front of him, he couldn't get himself into a vertical position. He could only lay back in a horizontal one. And so when he reached the underside of the main deck and he's looking right at this mouse hole, he just put his arms and his legs out and tried to push himself back as if he could fight the winch and keep himself from going into this hole. But there was nothing he could do, and so his pelvis first was pulled into the 10-inch hole. And as his body begins to literally break in half, he's screaming out in pain. And then by the time the hoist operator had hit stop, Gordon was already deceased, and only a section of his torso actually made it up through the hole. Gordon's company was found guilty of being blatantly delinquent on many safety protocols, and so they were fined £60,000, and then they paid an undisclosed amount to Gordon's family. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle. They had converted it into a rotating stage, and they put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages on this rotating stage. And so on each of these 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs about America. And so the way this would work, if you were in the audience, is you would walk into this theater that looked like a single theater with one stage right in front of you, but really what you were looking at is one of these 6 stages. And so the audience would sit down, they would see one of the acts, they'd see one performance on one of the stages, and then the stage would rotate. And so the audience would remain in the theater until all 6 stages had rotated in front of them and played their 2 to 4 minute long act. Debbie's job at America Sings was at the beginning of these shows where the audience would watch all 6 acts. She would go up before the very first act, she'd go on stage and she would greet the audience. And then the show would start, it would filter through all 6 of the stages, and then Debbie would get back on stage and she would say goodbye to that group of audience members. It was a simple gig and Debbie seemed to like it. And so on July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, and so it was 9 days after Debbie had started her job, Debbie was asked to come in for an evening shift. And so she left her house and she made it out to the attraction at about 10 p.m., which was right at the start of a show. And so she went right inside, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage and the show began. And so over the next 30 minutes, all 6 of the stages performed their acts. And then after the 6th act was done, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage. She said goodbye to the audience. And then as that audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Each of the 6 stages that made up this attraction had a fairly tall back wall. And behind each of these 6 back walls that were kind of in a ring was the center of the actual attraction. And in the center was this circular, fairly tall storage room. This storage room did not rotate. It was stationary. These stages and their respective back walls, they rotated around this storage room. And the gap between the outside of the storage room and the back of any of these back walls was only a few inches. It was very narrow, but it was big enough that a person in theory could get stuck back there. So it was a real hazard. However, Disney did not put any specific safeguards in place to prevent their staff from intentionally or unintentionally going into this space. They just told their staff to not go back there and be careful. So back on July 9th, after Debbie has said goodbye to the audience and she's walked towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage she's on to the adjoining stage. And when she does that, she either trips or falls or something happens which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the 2 back walls of the 2 stages she was on. And so she falls through that gap and then gets wedged between the outside of the storage room and the back of one of the back walls. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck. And so she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. None of the staff hear her, or they don't recognize that this is a real call for help. And this new wave of people that are coming in, the new audience, they're all talking loudly. There's music playing. They don't really hear her. And anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later say they thought it was part of the show. And so as Debbie is screaming bloody murder, she cannot get out of this gap, this narrow gap she's stuck in. These stages, they start to move because the show is going to start. And because Debbie has nowhere to go, when the stage began to rotate, she got forcibly dragged and twisted and rolled, and her body began to contort, and bones started to break, and she was forced to continue moving through this narrow space because the stage was just going to keep on going until it reached its next position. And so finally, after it dragged her all the way to its next position, Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. She probably had dozens of broken bones, but she was alive and she's still totally stuck and she's screaming with every ounce of energy she has. But again, the audience, even though they heard her screaming, they assumed it was part of the show. And apparently the staff also heard her screams and convinced themselves it was just no big deal. And so 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again. And so Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged and smashed and broken as the stage again rotates to its next position. And she's still not dead. She's screaming out for help. No one is coming to help her. And so the entire show would play out with the stage rotating through all of its sections. And then finally, at the end of the show, when one of the audience members alerted the staff that, hey, you should really go check out that screaming we heard. And at that point, they went for a look and they discovered Debbie, and she was very obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the America Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. Hey everybody!
Somewhere I'm flying through, no wings of mine in the rain, where it all feels just fine. Fingers trace stories on cold window panes, breathing out thoughts, watching fog leave a stain. Reality's tether feels thin as a thread. Who cares what they said when it lives in my head? I'm drifting away where no one can see, into a daydream, into a daydream. Colors all blur as the world.
heard yet, we announced some really big news recently. We are putting out a book, and it's amazing. It's called MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, and it's an amazing graphic novel we have been working on for over a year. And it's our very first book, so we're all very proud of this. We think it's going to be so amazing. So in this book, there are 9 stories, 5 of which are of the old variety, so you've heard them on YouTube, and they've been remastered and put into this book. And then you have 4 full-length, brand new stories, which are amazing, that have also been put inside of this book. And the way we made those 4 new stories is to have them replicate the feel of YouTube. In fact, I would say this whole book is like the written version of our YouTube channel. It's totally a throwback to our OG fans who found us on YouTube. This is the book for you. It's going to be so good. The book's not coming out until my birthday, October 1st, but you can pre-order it right now by going to book.ballenstudios.com. And also, after you pre-order, be sure to follow me